The Senate acts on budget bills, but the governor and Republican lawmakers are not pleased. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. We're still in somewhat of a state of deadlock at the Capitol, and we're going to talk about it today in a one-on-one conversation. So we're going to interview each other. Adam Rife is anchor and reporter for News Channel 20, WICS-TV here in Springfield.
Good to see you, Bernie.
Adam, good to see you too. I'm going to hold up a little kind of a newspaper project. It's a front page editorial that the State Journal-Register ran this week. It says unacceptable. Several other papers around the state went along with our editorial page editor and editor to say this. It came after a series of editorials about, prescriptions for what perhaps ought to be done about the state budget impasse, which is at about the 2-year mark now. As the legislature is barreling towards a deadline, it's not a hard deadline, but as of May 31st, middle of next week, things can be passed with a simple majority, most bills that will take effect immediately or go into effect the next fiscal year. After that, and the next fiscal year starts July 1st, after that it takes an extraordinary majority, and so you'll take more members. But the Senate Democrats, who have been working with Senate Republicans on some kind of a deal to get out of this lack of a state budget, Adam, as you know, decided to move forward with some big bills and did pass some grand bargain bills, including it would raise the state income tax. It would to 4.95% from 3.75. It would raise sales taxes or put sales taxes on some services, like I believe dry cleaning and certain things that were not there. And then Republicans said we weren't ready, and the governor said this is a terrible deal because there's no property tax relief. What's your take?
Well, we essentially saw Senate President Cullerton lay out there, it's time to act. He said, this series of bills will stem the bleeding. It's time that they take action. He was proud of the plan. He was proud that they accomplished it in the press conference afterwards. This all happened on Tuesday when it went down. Even though Leader Radonio said, our caucus cannot support this, we will not vote for it, the president said what's in this bill came from negotiations with Republicans. This is essentially a bipartisan plan. Obviously, the governor didn't agree with that, and with no Republican votes, it's difficult to prove on paper that it was bipartisan. But again, raising that income tax to 4.95%, as you said, expanding the tax base on services, were ideas that came from the governor. What they didn't pass, what wasn't a part of that, and what Republicans are harping on, was any kind of those structural reforms that they've been calling for the past 2 years now. And the big one, the key one that the governor has said specifically from here on out is going to be property tax reform. And they want the freeze. Right now they're battling over 4 years and 2 years and what happens after a freeze were to be lifted. So that's essentially where we're at. There was a whole lot of movement. Obviously it goes to the House. Anything goes there right now. And we're the ones at the time of taping, we're hoping that we don't miss anything big. But for the next several days, we're going to keep an eye on that. So,
well, I understand the House will be taking up many of these quote-unquote grand bargain bills, committee hearings over the weekend, I think on Sunday, and we'll see what action comes later. I know that the Democrats will argue, and President Cullerton will argue, that there are reforms that they have passed as part of the grand bargain, procurement reform, and in the Senate they've imposed term limits on their leaders just by rule. The governor, of course, wants an expanded thing and is talking more about that.
There was the education funding reform.
There's education funding reform, right? So some things have passed, but the Democrats will say it's never enough for the governor. The governor will say we've got to get real reform that means something, and so you have this frustration going on. And in the middle of it, and it's kind of interesting, it's similar to what has happened really for the entire time Governor Rauner has been in office. He pushes for things and then negotiates for things, but there's also advertising on the side. So he's been advertising these ads where he's got the plaid shirt and the duct tape saying we don't want solutions, just that those career politicians, unlike me, I've only been in office 2 years, he doesn't say that, just want to use duct tape to fix your problems. We need structural reform, and obviously now it's a property tax freeze, which some people argue would, potentially hamstring local governments who aren't getting state money for things. So he wants that, he's running ads, and then like like the day after the Senate voted on this package that included tax increases, and it's more than $5 billion in tax increases for a year, the Republican Party put out calls, automated calls, robocalls they call them, to like the districts of 19 House members, Democrats, who they're saying, don't go along with Mike Madigan and don't do this plan, and you've got to get real reform like the governor wants. So the attacks go on. Does that help? I don't know. I've never seen this kind of thing in the middle of a session, and we've really had this for 2 years now because the governor ran $1 million in ads against Mike Madigan in May or June of his first year in office in 2015, and that's when we stopped having a budget.
It's really representative of the governor's entire time in office, because they'll talk business, they'll talk either in the Blue Room or in front of the governor's office or wherever they may be, Facebook Live, talk about negotiating, even on issues that they're far apart. We want to keep working. I'm willing to work with the Democrats on a property tax freeze. And then, as you said, the cameras go off or the reporters walk away, and all of a sudden you're in campaign mode again, and it's just automatic every single time. And so I don't know that the lawmakers themselves are taking that to heart. Certainly, I think the voting public gets frustrated with that.
I think they notice it, especially
I think they
with all the
certainly
money
notice
in the
it.
campaign. Yeah.
I think they certainly notice it, but it's coming from both sides. We heard Leader Radonio say, even though my caucus cannot support these spending bills, we're willing to keep working and keep working and keep working. Well, her party, moments later, is sending out those calls that are pretty, produced fairly
Christine
quickly.
Radonio, Republican leader of the Senate,
Yep.
From Lamont up in the suburbs. Yeah, we'll see. And they said they were close. So
the governor's quote about a week ago was, "They've never been closer." And now you could argue, how involved was he in those negotiations? Because for many months we were wondering, he may not be in this at all. Along with Speaker Madigan, very quiet for a couple weeks there, as the Senate President and Senate Leader Radonio were chiefly in charge of those negotiations. So was the governor way off base, or was he wistfully optimistic? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and he's talked about things being close for a while now, but then he also talked about it in his his budget address and State of the State address. He talked about one of them where he said, "I'm really encouraging the Senate negotiators to go and do their own thing," which was without Speaker Madigan, the Democratic head of the House, and without the governor at that time. Then Republicans in the Senate pulled their votes off an initial number of bills. The Democrats accused the governor of pulling those votes. The governor denied it, but on we go. So this property tax, it does seem like what used to be a turnaround agenda of like 40 items the governor wanted 2 years ago. Now, property tax freeze and workers' compensation reform are a couple of big things. When the Senate moved the bills last week, they were not part of it.
Right.
And Bill Brady is a state senator from Bloomington, a Republican. He has been working, saying he wants like parity, which means if you do an income tax increase, make it for a set period of time, like 4 years, and then the property tax freeze for that amount of time. But it's not there, and then the Democrats, including Senator Cullerton, the president of the Senate, and his spokesman, they say, we're still working, the bills can still change, we can add that back in the House, but we just had to move something. So the whole property tax thing is just interesting because it seems to be a new strong demand of the governor in recent weeks, and given the fact that so many local governments are not getting as much from the state, or local services, all kinds of things are not getting things from the state that they used to, many local governments are worried that they won't have flexibility to fund their schools and other programs, potholes and things like that, if they can't raise property taxes without a referendum. But it also polls very well, so the governor can have something as a win if he has to go for a tax increase, which he and the party have spoken against, even though he's always said we need new revenue.
Yeah, the Democrats have said that sounds good in ads, but it's not realistic at this point. And some of that debate over the 2 versus 4 years that I mentioned earlier, Democrats said, I talked to the president's office this week, and they said 4 years was an option at one point, but we wanted exceptions in some areas that the governor wasn't willing to budge on. And so the ship has essentially sailed on a 4-year property tax freeze from the Democrats' side. If we look at a taxpayer's point of view, a property tax freeze would be great if it caps it low, keeps your taxes low. But look at it from a school district, as you mentioned, or if you're a public works department that needs to pay for essential services right now. If you limit how much revenue is coming in with 2 years, 4 years. I mean, that's difficult to budget, as we know. So that's essentially where the debate is at right now. The governor has said we want to even it up, the parity word there, with what that income tax increase would be, and that's the 4 years right now. So whether we can get some movement on that in the next few days remains to be seen.
Yeah, and part of the complication of all this is school funding.
Yeah.
I talked to Barbara Flynn Curry, who is a top lieutenant to Speaker Madigan in the House. She's a longtime member of the General Assembly, very smart person from Chicago. She was saying how Illinois spends the state government gives such a low amount. I think it's around a quarter of what schools get comes from the state in Illinois now, whereas, and so your property taxes pay for most of it. This is what's wrong with the lack of parity in the school funding formula that people like Andy Manar, state senator from Macoupin County, talk about all the time, where if you have a rich property district with either a lot of stores or factories or expensive homes, then you can put plenty in your schools and you can give $30,000 a year to students. But in poorer districts, that doesn't happen. So there's also this ongoing battle to fix the formula, and property taxes, there wouldn't be so much burden on them if the state would pay more, but of course that takes more revenue too. And that is a problem that has developed over the years, and people have been talking about it for years. And finding the solution to just that at any time, even if there wasn't a budget impasse, would be difficult. So that's part of where we're at.
I haven't been here as long as you, but several years ago when I did come here to cover the State House, I think the first bill I covered was SB 1 at the time, which was a school funding formula, and naively thinking this is going to move. How could you not move on this? Well, here we are several years later, still trying to get the same thing accomplished in some fashion.
And as Senator Manar has been working on for some time now, but other people in the past, no school district, no legislator wants to vote for a bill that gives their school district less money.
Right.
And so they put in something called a hold harmless, which means nobody loses money, at least for the first year. Manar has been pushing that. The problem is that all costs more money, and if you are in a deficit, the backdrop of all of this, of course, is that the state is $13 to $14 billion in a backlog of bills yet unpaid, in addition to the budget gap itself. One of the interesting things about the bill that has the sales tax increases and the income tax increase, when it got over to the House, the bill was claimed, I guess, as sponsored by Jean Ives, who is from the suburbs of Chicago. She's a very conservative, anti-tax Republican, and she also got a letter, I guess, from the Department of Revenue saying it may not be constitutional to raise sales tax just on some services but not others. Satellite and cable, I think, streaming services and cable, I think the satellite would be charged more in tax than cable.
Yeah.
And so there's some question if this would be fair or if people could go to court and overturn it. So it possibly is one thing that could hold up the whole process as we move along.
Some bemused smiles by a lot of people in the House as they realized that Jeannie Ives became the chief sponsor of SB 9. Because, as you said, she rarely passes up an opportunity to oppose a new tax or a tax increase. And so a strategic move of sorts here. There is a way, and I'd have to research, it's a complicated process, to get that bill out of her hands. The Democrats could do it, but for the time being, she is the sponsor and explicitly said, my goal is to amend it and make sure that we either have pro-business reforms attached to it before we send it back to the Senate, or other of those reforms that the governor has pounded for the past several months. But it's interesting to see that letter. It came from the Department of Revenue, I believe, their chief counsel, and essentially explored, didn't say whether the taxes were constitutional or not constitutional, didn't say whether they would go or not pass, but just kind of exploring, is this going to be a sticking point at some time?
Yeah.
And it looks like they have a couple, obviously this is coming from the governor's administration, but it looks like they have some points right now.
Yeah, well, again, none of this stuff is easy in a year when there's not a giant crisis. Speaking of crisis, we are in the middle of a campaign. We've got several Democrats running for governor: Daniel Biss, who's in the Senate from Evanston; Amewa Pawar, who's an alderman from Chicago; Bob Diber, who's a regional superintendent of schools from Southern Illinois; Chris Kennedy from Kenilworth, a son of RFK; and J.B. Pritzker of Chicago, of the Hyatt Hotel family. He is clearly spending more money online than the others because he has it. He recently put $7 million into his campaign. that used to be a big thing, except Governor Rauner last December put $50 million into his own campaign. And then one of his friends, Ken Griffin of Chicago, the richest man in Illinois,
I believe,
within the last 2 weeks, I think, put $20 million into the Rauner campaign. So he's raised like $70 million just sitting there waiting to be spent, which I think does add pressure to the whole system. But Pritzker started a website called Crisis Creatin' Rauner. That's creatin' without a G at the end of it, to sound, I guess, like Bruce Rauner when he
folksy.
Yeah, folksy. And it basically, it uses a Chicago Tribune editorial board, I think, quote that Rauner said a couple years ago: crisis creates opportunity. We're going to use this crisis to move the state forward.
Then candidate Rauner, right?
Possibly a candidate Rauner.
It was early on, if anything.
Yeah, well, he has said things like that, and then, of course, he's blamed the crisis on everybody else. Democrats say and as these robocalls were going out to, like, House members, Pritzker's campaign started putting out robocalls too, and maybe going statewide, or at least into those districts, saying Bruce Rauner is holding the state budget hostage to his agenda. That's what the Democrats have been saying for 2 years. And so it's another voice, and it's another well-paid voice. And so I just say that, unfortunately or fortunately, the campaign is on. Now it's not just Bruce Rauner who's campaigning, but you have Democrats who are seeking his job, doing as much or doing a lot, and getting some of this negative stuff said. So I don't know if that adds pressure to it. Rauner seems to all say it's just part of the system. When you ask him about what the Republicans are doing, Democrats are clearly doing it now too.
Yeah, I don't think it helps. It may not hurt, but it doesn't help. But if anybody's under any impression, if we're in the campaign season, just check your email inbox. Anytime anybody does anything, you have instant reaction ready to go, especially from these well-funded campaigns. And we have yet to hear if it's long been rumored that Speaker Madigan and the Democratic Party is behind the Pritzker campaign, at least backing them.
Yeah, and last I heard, Steve Brown, the Madigan spokesman, said he has not chosen a favored candidate.
Right,
but
which is a good answer.
Some unions have lined up behind Pritzker, so people think Madigan is involved.
Right. But with that kind of support, you're starting to see the money that you mentioned on the Rauner side, and Pritzker said he's going to self-fund and certainly has no issues there as far as funding goes in what will probably be another record-breaking campaign. I think it does put pressure on people. The governor, I asked him in one of the interviews we had this week, what are some of the things you can point to as successes? Because I think the thing that's going to dominate everything is not being able to pass a single budget right now. Our friend Dave Dahl, in his radio interview with the governor, said a lot of these campaigns with the duct tape look like you're going to come down and shake up Springfield. That was the original ad 2 years ago, the original campaign. You've already been here for 2 years, and you have to run at some point on the record. And he'll point to record funding for education and a couple other things, but I think the budget's going to outweigh everything, and that's what the Democrats are really going to pound him on. And
we will see where that goes. There have been some other governmental things happening. The director of the Department of Children and Family Services is George Sheldon. There have been some unfortunate situations where you've had in Joliet Township, Samaj Crosby was a young child who was in a home that had been visited several times by state inspectors, and she passed away, and there were 3 deaths in Chicago. And George Sheldon has been rumored, Tribune has done some big stories on this, to possibly be looking at a job back in Florida where he came to Illinois from. And there was also one of the situations that he was asked about at a hearing this past week at the State House. There's a Blue Star plan in Cook County that offers overtime pay to investigators of child abuse cases who close cases within 14 days. And the word was, I believe, that they're overwhelmed, there are too many cases, and life and death situations like this shouldn't be put on a fast track like that as if it's a factory. So
yeah, Mary Flowers came out strong, saying,
a state representative from Chicago,
right, saying we're essentially putting a price tag on closing these cases when lives are at stake. And Samaj Crosby, the case that you're mentioning in Joliet when that child died, investigators have been there 11 times. It was 11 different cases, and they didn't find any wrongdoing at the time. Now, whether they had closed those too early or whether it was legitimate is yet to be decided. But essentially what the DCFS is trying to determine in these ethics hearings is maybe a little bit of self-reporting, but trying to say we don't have the resources right now. Our policy is to expunge records that don't lead to an arrest or to serious charges being brought. And in the case of Samaj Crosby and others, 11 times they didn't find anything, so those records essentially go away. In the one time investigators are going to go next time, hypothetical now, you want to have that backlog of, you want to have a record of all those other times. So it's really a sad situation, obviously, because lives are at stake for those children, but that also is the solution going to be more money? Because the thing he keeps saying is we don't have the resources.
He meaning Director Sheldon?
Correct.
Yeah, and I think it just points out how serious some of these state jobs are.
Yeah.
I mean, again, DCFS child abuse investigator, just think of going to that home.
Exactly.
Tough situation. There was another hearing this week on the rental of warehouse space in Springfield. There have been a few different buildings that the state has leased in a couple of, at least one case, they could have bought the building for less than $1 million, and they're spending over, I think, 5 years, more than like about $2.5 million. The director of CMS, Department of Central Management Services, did say, hey, the people who are renting this to us put $1 million in improvements into it. So there's nuances here, and there were all these approvals. On the other hand, the state is supposed to use existing state buildings when they can. So this is an ongoing controversy. There's a couple of representatives from the Chicago area, legislators, Democrat and Republican, who are saying we should question this and look. So it will continue to be an issue I think we see Governor Rauner dealing with, as particularly Democrats pick at him, but some Republicans too worried about possible waste of state money.
Yeah, I don't think it's the chief issue in the coming weeks, but it's certainly an annoyance for the governor. But if there is a waste of funds, then obviously it's something they want to pursue. I think Representative McSweeney has really come out strong on this from the House floor recently, talking about,
right.
as you mentioned,
and then Senator Cullerton, who is Tom Cullerton, who's a cousin of the president of the Senate.
Right, saying if we already have people in a building on the state fairgrounds working and operating there, why do we need to move them and lease a building at the same time? So.
Interesting. There's been kind of a little barrage of news in the past week around Springfield. There's a guy named Chris Stone, who is a lobbyist and a business guy and a developer, who has been pushing to add to grand bargain bills a possible casino for the city of Springfield. Already the whole idea that the House and Senate, or the Senate people, the Democrats and Republicans have kind of agreed on, is a number of new casinos around the state.
Right.
Used to be so novel just to gamble, but now it's kind of everywhere. There would be a casino in Chicago. I know Danville would get one, I think the Rockford area. So Chris Stone, who also runs a medical marijuana business and also is involved in gambling parlors, the small ones, in Springfield. I think he's got a chain of about 7 of them. Lucy's Place, I believe, is saying Springfield should be there too, and a letter has gone out from the mayor of Springfield and several of the aldermen to legislators saying, yeah, we'd be interested in this, at least to look at it. And that could obviously, it's been talked about for 20 years in Springfield, but never has been serious. Of course, in the past, you couldn't build a casino unless it was on water.
Right.
And now we're kind of opening up because we have this budget impasse and everything looks terrible. So
the nearest one, I think, in the proposal, I think there's 6 that they're talking about. Terry Link was the chief sponsor in the House, and he
Senate?
in the Senate, pardon me, and he came out and he did say at this time, after Chris Stone floated the idea of a Springfield casino, Terry Lake said at this time there's no plans to amend that to include Springfield. And so in this bill, so Chris Stone looking to gain support. Obviously it would bring in some revenue. You could talk about ethics. There have been debates for years about why gambling would be good or bad for local municipalities. But Springfield City Council today or yesterday this week,
in the last few days,
thank you, as of taping, coming out in support of it, essentially saying it's something we'd like to pursue and like to help in any way. Obviously, the budget issues of Springfield have been debated ad nauseum for many years as well, and there is some real estate downtown. He had talked about in the old state capitol area.
Yeah, somewhere downtown. I mean, he's also got a different proposal for the open space now that's near the governor's mansion that several people are making proposals on. He said it wouldn't be there, but more downtown, but he wasn't specifying which building.
Yeah.
He just said it wasn't one that he owns already.
So in 5 years, we could look back at this as well. That was when it started.
We will see where that goes. Another just an odd and interesting issue. It made the front page of Chicago paper, or at least one of them. The population there is down 8,600. So there's a little finger pointing. The governor's people made a statement, the mayor of Chicago has been in for 2 years. Look at how terrible things are. And the mayor's people said, with the governor blocking the state budget for the last 2 years or holding it hostage, then nothing is happening and people are leaving because we don't have certainty for our businesses. So that's the kind of finger pointing we get. Unless we get a budget, we'll see what happens with that. We did want to mention some federal issues, a couple of things. President Trump was out of the country, but his people put out a $4.1 trillion federal budget plan. It has cuts to Medicaid, it cuts backing of long-distance Amtrak routes, many of which go through Illinois. Particularly Senator Durbin and Senator Duckworth, the two Democrats who represent Illinois, were very upset with it. I think there were some agriculture cuts, and Congress people like Darren LaHood and Rodney Davis are saying, we want to make sure we fund things that are necessary. So that's among the things that I guess will be issues in the federal budget that starts October 1st, but also in the election of 2018 as people look to run against them.
Yeah, and we'll also have the Congressional Budget Office coming out and scoring the ACA repeal that the Republicans had pushed through the House. So 23 million was the number that they said, new uninsured based on that. That score was one that Democrats said, let's wait and see before it passes out of the House. Obviously, they got it before the Senate would vote on this, but it's a big one, that American Health Care Act.
Well, and I know that Rodney Davis and Darren LaHood were both people who said we've got to get rid of Obamacare, repeal and replace.
Anything's better than
We'll do
nothing.
it better. So many people were without coverage, and coverage was unaffordable. So they're still making those arguments, but the 23 million people who will lose, I believe it's over the next 10 years, health care under this Congressional Budget Office report is a big number to fight. So the political battle goes on, and we know that what the U.S. House passed with the Republicans, and then they had a Rose Garden ceremony with the president to celebrate passage. Even Republicans in the Senate have said something different will happen before a final version comes. So that's one to watch. With that, perhaps one other quick thing. It is a good time, we hope, for development or the homes of the monarch butterfly, which is I think it's our state butterfly, but the Illinois Department of Transportation recently announced that as they mow, they will avoid mowing down milkweed because that's what monarch butterflies feed on, and we've been losing populations.
We smile, but those populations have plummeted.
And we need to move forward and hope all for the best. Adam Rife, thank you for your thoughts. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.